Good. So this is the first Enchant podcast, and there are three of us here already in conversation. So you're coming in a little bit late, but you're here. My name's Craig Chalquist.
My name is Rita Patel.
And my name is Dana van Hess.
So we were just now we were talking a little bit about what's happening in the world. All kinds of things. Wow.
And you said, well, Donna was talking about the documentary on Woodstock and about hope and do people have hope or not? I don't know. But I was thinking about what Craig said, the world is what we make it.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I think the last thing we left on was magical thinking. And I'm just thinking about all the stories. Part of the reason why we're here is I look at it as like we enchant ourselves sometimes with these really interesting self-created stories and narratives. And I think that's what I'm living with right now. Yeah.
Yeah. We've been kicking this word around for, I guess, about a year now, enchantivism. And there's been workshops done on it and some certificate programs and things like that. And part of where it goes is a number of us hear a lot of bad news, whether it's watching the actual news or just thinking about the state of the planet ecologically or whatever it is. And we're not hearing much about what's going right and, you know, where we want to be as a species, how we want to live with each other as our neighbors, and how we want to be with ourselves. And yet there's all these really great things that are happening that don't tend to hit the public press very often. So one of the questions for enchantivism is, what kind of stories can we tell that either celebrate successful things that are going on, or going on the mythic, fictional, folkloric side? What does that have to offer us? What sorts of old wisdom is there that we can apply in our day from those old stories, you know? There's an image that's been coming up for me a lot, and as these images, these archetypal images tend to do, often they're reflected simultaneously in your personal life, but also in collective life. It's amazing how often I have to remind myself and my students and some of my friends that what we take as purely personal is happening outside too. We're barometers for it, you know?
Yeah.
So there's this magical beast who keeps flying up for me called the phoenix, and probably everybody listening to this has at least heard of that bird. But a great thing about the phoenix, well, two great things. One is that it's worldwide, so the version that a lot of us are familiar with comes from Phoenicia, but there's the phoenix in Mexico, there's a phoenix in Egypt, in Greece, you know. There's the thunderbird in Native America, and so it's all over the place. That bird gets around, you know. And in most of the versions, when it gets old, it burns its own nest up, and then the fire cleanses and purifies it, and it rises renewed for another 100 or 1,000 or 400 or however many years, you know. And it's a new bird, but it flies out of the remains of its old self, you know. So there's this image of renewal, you know. So I'm just sitting with that and what that means. That bird's been flying through my life and my dreams for a while. So
I think that's really interesting in the work that I do. I work with small and medium-sized enterprises mainly, and I work with sustainability and corporate social responsibility. And I've been thinking of words in terms of remember, restore, rejuvenate, because, well, actually we were talking about it a bit earlier, that I think we forget and we lose things from the past that we could really apply today. It doesn't all have to be new and you know, technologically advanced. There's a lot of things that from the past we can actually still learn from, or we can like reinvent it and you know, put it here in the Netherlands, they talk about, you know, putting something in a new jacket so that you can actually sort of apply it to a modern day situation. I think sometimes what I miss is imagination. It's like we've forgotten, we don't imagine. It's like it's just, this is the way things are, and we're plodding along, and we don't, I don't know if we don't take the time to sort of step back and imagine how we would like to see the world, or how we would like to live. And, you know, you've got to start with having some idea of what you'd like it to be. And then you can see whether it's achievable. And obviously not everything is going to be attainable, but if we never take that kind of, what would I like to see, you know, happening, I think we just keep on the same path.
That's why I like the looking at the older stories and just storytelling in general, because I don't know who said this, and maybe many people have said it in different ways, but the idea that if we can't imagine it, it won't exist. That reality is what we imagine. And I was, when you were talking, I was thinking about, oh, well, I do a lot of work with, I'm an artist, so I do a lot of work with and read about people who are reusing, repurposing, and all that. And that to me is a similar thing, putting something in a new jacket. And it's just like, okay, well, this was the myth that people had back then, but how does it work for us now? And so I work with storytelling as a way to imagine what's possible, but first having people imagine what's possible for themselves and each other. So it's very relationship based. And it's just very interesting how I don't know if we're really taught to imagine, because I think we're taught to learn something and then keep doing it, because what I find is that people tend to stick with the same idea, the same story over and over. And I think we all get these images and symbols and signs coming to us, but I don't know if we're seeing it, if we're thinking about things the same way, and how all this other stuff is just noise and in the way, you know? Yeah, that's what I notice a lot. Like, people want this simplicity, but it's kind of like, Donna, when you were talking about being in Italy, like there's all this activity up above, but you know, underground there's a different type of activity where you actually have no control. Yeah, so what is, I don't know, it's kind of like our house. We have no control right now. Everything's disrupted. It's all dug up. Cars get stuck and everything. But yeah, so I don't know where I was going with that, but there you go. Yeah.
It seems like that's one of the things that frightens people about the imagination. It can lead you anywhere.
Yes.
And we try to control it, you know, even like when you do corporate problem solving, which is a really valuable activity. I've facilitated that a couple of times. And
yeah,
we do a version of that at school where I teach too, you know, and we do it in the classroom. And it's valuable, but oftentimes the condition is that it has to be for practical purposes, otherwise it's no good. And so there's no space that's created. I learned this from studying Hermann Hesse when I was a college student, that he was really, being an artist and a writer, he was really clear, we need space to be imaginative. And I laughed when I recently returned to some of his writings, and there was this rant that I came across, and he said, under no circumstances should we settle for reality.
Yeah, I run into that a lot, because this is what I do in corporate settings. Like, how do you bring the imaginative, and you get there through play and all that. And I sometimes don't like myself because I put it in the language of practical and productivity, knowing full well that it goes beyond that. But I'm starting where I can. And but that's the conversation I'm in right now. It's like, it's not, we know that it can do this, it can be practical, or it can help people work better, whatever, but that's not why we do it. And that's not why we read stories. It's not why we get to know, when you were talking about Petra, and I just wanted to know more. And it's like, there's no practical reason. But the thing is, what do I really know? Maybe there is, but that's not the point. The point is the experience and knowing of it, because I think that's what informs our reality and gives us hope.
Yeah, I think for me, the idea of using maybe different language, or Rita often sees, you know, it talks about how can you see this differently. I think part of visiting Petra, or what I experienced in Italy, and my husband and I did a course here in The Hague. They called it Hagueology, sort of like archaeology, but of The Hague. And walking through the streets of The Hague, you have a completely different idea now of the city. I mean, you know, from the time of the Romans. So when I walk in the streets here now, and I think to myself, 400-500 years ago, Romans were walking where I walk today. How were they dressed? What did they do? How did they, you know, where did they find their water? Because there's like a little underground stream here in The Hague. But just those sorts of thoughts. The coastline actually has receded and come back in this time. Where Peter and I live was sea. So to me, it sort of fills you with this incredible feeling of wonder and fascination. And I think, you know, Craig, you were saying about space. I think I don't know if we're not allowed, but we don't take the time to sort of really reflect on that and think about it, what that means to have all of that in us, because it sort of has been channeled through all the generations. And here we are today, carrying all of that resourcefulness and resilience and, you know, whatever was needed in those days to survive, to live, and to thrive. And we now sort of, I don't know, struggle to kind of think we, you know, that there is hope, that there is something we can do about this, that there are, like you were saying, there are like little pockets of amazing things happening. Nobody's talking about that.
You know, taking imagination, space, and place together just for a second, I'm reminded of an activity I used to do when I taught some of my students about those things in San Francisco at CIIS. And we used to do, for one day, we did a tour out in the Soma district where the school is. And the only thing I asked of the students was, the two things I asked was, number one, free your imagination up, so just fantasize as we do this. And two, look for startling things, whether they're mythic or folkloric, like imagine people are in costumes or what have you, and let's just see what happens.
Oh,
and
lovely.
Every time I did that tour, something fascinating, more than one thing happened. And I remember at one point we were talking about how, so it's me and the group of students in the streets, you know, and we were like, isn't it amazing how we start talking about something and then it manifests out here in the streets of San Francisco. And I said, it reminds me of The Matrix, and I'm just waiting for the woman in the red dress to show up. And as soon as I said that, a woman in a bright red dress came walking around the corner, and we all laughed, you know. So when you do that, when you let your imagination go a little bit, it puts you in this field of possibilities where anything creative can occur. And it's outside of you as well as inside, as the ancient alchemists talked about. The soul is outside the body as well as inside.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more, I guess it's practicing, because we live in a culture of productivity and, you know, utilitarian usefulness, and we're seen as functionaries, as John O'Donohue says.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just practicing a little bit and seeing and just experiencing it and see what that means to you. Otherwise, it's just you don't even know why. You won't know why something matters until you try it. So I like that exercise a lot.
Yeah.
And that's why I like introducing people to other people's stories, like nothing beyond, nothing larger. And it just, they start imagining differently. I did an exercise once with a group, but I do this often, but one of the times I did it with a group, I asked them to write the story of their name, and a few people couldn't write anything because they weren't even thinking about themselves anymore. And it's just, so that alone, after a while they got there, but it's like then they can start imagining who they are again.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even with
There's,
language. I'm working with an organization where uh, their culture is love-based, and I always think, well, that's such a big word. What does it mean? And going deep into that, it's very interesting. What are all the stories around that? And where do they want to go with that? Yeah.
I think even just asking that question, what do we mean by something, whatever the word is or whatever the context is? We don't even, we just sort of assume something, and based on that, off we go. And sometimes just taking the time to actually ask that question, what do we actually mean by this? And then thinking through, and then maybe asking questions or coming to the why of something.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I'm blanking on it, but there's in folklore and other stories, there's about like the place that you're in can help you imagine, because it's also alive and imagining. And so, I can't think of any stories right now. I don't know if either of you have come across anything
yeah,
like that.
there's, it's not place oriented, but there's a line in the Gnostic Gospels where in some of the Gnostic Gospels, Jesus is considered a Jewish wisdom teacher. He's a sage who's enlightened. And in other Gnostic Gospels, they're not Christian. They're both. And there's a phrase that he gives his followers. He says, "Stand in the place that you can reach," which I always loved. It's like, make the most of where you are right now. And if we took that parapsychologically in the sense of like the presence of a location, there's lots of folklore in Hawaii about how people get lost somewhere on one of the islands, and then they dream. They may not even realize who she is, but they dream of this woman with very dark skin and red eyes and black hair, and if she likes them, she says, "Oh, take that trail over there," And then they tell people who live in Hawaii, and they're like, "Oh, Pele is guiding you," So that happens all over the world. There are stories in Japan about Mount Fuji showing up as a beautiful young woman to guide people, and again and again throughout folklore, these figures, and they can be either or not either, because there's not two genders. There's many, but they can be male, female, anything in between, neither, whatever, But some presence that shows up in a story or a dream or what have you, and it interacts with people directly. So that's when I teach nature mythology and nature folklore, I always include a few of those stories, because they so perfectly underline how our imagination is also, as Lolly Mitchell would put it, it's eco-imaginal. It includes the place that we're in and the ecology and the nature. It's not just human imagination.
I sometimes also think that we're very reactive. We'll sort of wait. We wait for something, a sign or something to happen, or whatever it is that we have in our minds, before we take a step or before we try something. And I sometimes think we should be braver. I don't know, Rita, it reminded me of that poem about, stand still, because the forest is not lost. The forest knows where you are. It reminded me a bit of that, so just, it's okay. And just, wait. And then, but to be more sort of the one acting, taking that step rather than waiting and seeing what's going on around us. And is somebody else doing it? Because, okay, if somebody else is doing it, then maybe I can also do it. And not being brave enough, just to step out and say, okay, this is my path.
I love that. I love what you said. The forest is not lost. Isn't
there a poem like that? I seem to remember when we did the David White course that we did a poem like that.
I think so. I don't recall the specifics of it, but it's a great reminder. Like, I mean, because I don't know, we just think of ourselves so much, and not that we're part of this space too, this land. And so I used to collect rocks, and I used to collect everything, but I loved rocks because they look old, in the sense that it probably took a long time to form, and I have no idea for any rock. And I lived in a city, so I am not very interactive with deep nature. And so this week, we've been collecting big rocks, mini boulders, because the road is all dug up. We've been bringing them into our space for landscaping. And I can't help but wonder about, like, well, how old is this space? And they found a whole nother road under our road. Like the city was actually lower than what it is now. And it's just this really interesting, I don't know, I'm living in these different stories that I never would have if I hadn't, if this didn't happen with the pipes.
Yeah.
There's a really great book by Peter Ackroyd, and it's called London, the Biography. And he gives fascinating examples of how like, you know, a sauna gets built above an ancient Roman bath, but the builders don't know because it's all covered with layers of land, you know. And yet they reenact it. These themes stay in the land over and over, or a road goes through and it's on top of an ancient Roman road that nobody knew about because it's not on the maps anymore. And when they excavate to build the new one, then they find it, you know.
Yeah.
And he mentions that there was this piece of, I think it was an old piece of Anglo-Saxon pottery, if I remember correctly, that was dug up when they were building the underground. And there were some ancient letters on it, W-E-R, what was it? W-E-R-H-E-R-E or something like that. And he mentions that when he saw it, it's like the underworld is saying, "We are here."
We are still here.
It's actually quite a fascinating idea because we're always wondering what's out there, and then we think about space, but what's down there is just as interesting.
Yeah.
You know, where did we come from? You know, what are we standing on? It's just as interesting.
Yeah, I read a book about the scientist. She's contemporary. She's still around. I think it's called Lab Girl. And did you know the book?
No.
Oh, okay, it's but she is I don't know the actual term for her field, but dirt. And so going through the layers of dirt in a place and all the information that comes from that, and you don't think that people just focus on dirt, but it sounds very specific, but it's actually very generalizable because it's, yeah, so it was just very interesting to me because it's like you can think about place in all different ways. And again, because of all that's being dug up repeatedly, it's just, I'm thinking, oh, there was clay here. What does that mean? What was happening here before? What does that mean for later? I don't know, you know.
Yeah.
I like to wonder, and not that the wondering necessarily goes anywhere, but yeah.
I was talking
I
about,
also like to wonder.
yeah. I was talking about soil, that like the psychology of soil, if we could put it that way, to my colleague Shepard Bliss some years ago, and he made this one of his great aphoristic statements. He said, "Into the soil means into the depths." I always really like that.
Yeah.
And do you know what? I think that it describes the feeling I got about her life and character, like really going into the depth and going deep. And yeah.
I'll have to read that book. That sounds cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's about her life, and she's young. She's probably 50, and it's about a lot of things, and so it's not it's someone's story, but it touches on so many different things, and the dirt part was just so interesting. The soil and and what that meant. Coming from a place where you don't talk about things and are really more on practical, and then where that led her. It's very interesting. Yeah, because it also talked about her mental illness. Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking that there's this move that psychology sometimes makes it's like half imaginative or half helpful, where we think about objects outside of us or dirt or what have you, and then we convert them into psychology, right? what is the, what am I excavating in my life, for instance? Questions like that. And they're perfectly valid as far as they go. But when we work parapsychologically, when we work with imagination outside of us as well as in, we can move it in the other direction as well and say, what do my inner processes, feelings, moods, fantasies, past, whatever, say about what's going on outside? What do they tell me about the soil or about whatever it is that's going on out there?
Mm-hmm.
When we did those tours in San Francisco, at one point we reached a corner near the school, and I think it was 10th and Market, and no, 10th and Mission. And there was a lot of water imagery around us. There was water in the street as well. People were hosing things off, but the buildings had these wavy patterns and all that. So I decided to speculate a little bit. And I said, I bet there's an underground stream here. I bet that's, what shows up. And if we lived here, maybe we would have water dreams too, So our inner process and our cultural process, our art and architecture, I wonder if they're reflecting something below us, And at that point, one of the students in the group said that he had knowledge of some of the construction that was happening and that there actually was an underground stream. I don't remember if it was still active or not. So that might be an example of working it in the other direction.
Yeah,
and that's telling us about what the land is thinking about,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What I like about that going in that direction, and even what we're talking about, is start building a relationship with the with the land, or elements of the land, and elements of other parts of nature, because we're part of nature too. But not in the one direction just for us, so sometimes you see a bird, it's like, oh, what does the bird symbolism mean for my life, but it can go the other way too,
Mm.
Yeah.
And I think about, if you're in that more, maybe there's more chance of understanding what's happening on the planet in terms of climate. Yeah, I just find it so interesting that we're so interested in the weather, the daily moment to moment, but we're not connected in a way that is broader. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
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 I think we've also, there's that disconnect, I think, between ourselves and nature. The idea, like Rita, you just said, we are nature, but somehow we don't seem to think of ourselves like that. We sort of have this idea of it's separate from us. It's something, it's not something that I'm a part of. If you stand with your feet in the dirt,
Mm-hmm.
if you feel that connection, but somehow we don't. We sort of think nature is something for us to use, control, and I think that disconnect needs to be, I don't know, turned around, and we need to connect again.
Yeah. But a lot of native cultures have stories around that.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of in folklore too. There's a lot of warnings about what happens when you get disconnected that way. So there's an old Korean folktale about different spirits of the land that come into a kingdom, and they're trying to warn the king and his counselors that they're out of balance. But the king and his chief priests don't know how to speak the language of nature anymore. So every time one of these spirits shows up, like the earth spirit comes and it does a dance in front of the king, and then the water spirit and these others, and the king asks the priest, well, what's the title of that dance? And the priest just makes it up because he doesn't know. So, on the day before the kingdom falls, when the mountain spirit comes down and does a particularly frantic dance, the king says, what does that mean? And I don't know, it means celebrate the king, or so okay, let's build a pavilion, and but what the title of the dance actually is, he who rules wisely understands the sign of the time and orders the people to flee in great numbers.
Yeah.
So there's lots of cautionary stories, all over the world about what happens when we get that far out of balance.
Yeah.
And then the animals turn on us, or the weather turns on us, or what have you. But on the other side of it, there's lots of stories like Aristeas, the beekeeper, where he commits crimes against the underworld goddesses, and he comes home one day, the bees are all gone. You know, today we would call that colony collapse disorder. But he learns from that. He talks to the spirit of water, which is his mother, and then he talks to the spirit of the ocean, and they finally tell him, you got to descend into the underworld and make some apologies. So he needs to get initiated. He needs to get mature, you know, and when he does that, the bees come back.
Mm.
So
Yeah. I'm seeing that we're at the end of our allotted time.
We are, yes. I've noticed that too.
Yeah. So how do we want to close, and how do we want to close for today? Yeah.
yeah. Well, I just, I mean, I don't know like a definitive way, but I just want to like wave my hand and nod at the phoenix of imagination.
Yes.
That's kind of flying through our whole conversation, and the spirit of remembering, excavating, renewal, listening to the depths, listening to nature. You know, I think that's all possibly bound up in that image of rebirth.
Yes.
I feel there's been some broadening in my imagination just through this conversation, and I would just like to add, there's like this whole sense of space for all this to come in. I think, Donna, you mentioned that earlier, this idea of having the space for that. Yeah.
Yes, I think what's really struck me is the flow of the conversation, because as we said before, that it would just be a sort of spontaneous, and it's been really interesting how things have kind of linked into each other and the flow of the conversation, and I've found that really inspiring.
And I think that's what we were talking about, just the being in the conversation with whoever.
Yes.
There is that relationship, you know.
Yes.
Talking about what were you talking about, Craig, with the water? Mission district, I think.
The Soma district, yeah, the water underneath and surfacing in art and architecture, and
it was all it's all there. So
yes.
It just came to the forefront.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, this was lovely. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I also really enjoyed our talk and our conversation. It's been so interesting, so many different perspectives. I like that.
Yeah.
Me too, and I hope the listener asks the question of what stories inspires me, what things are happening outside as well as inside inspire me, what gets my imagination going and frees it.
Yes.
And how to engage it more often.
Yes.